There's an African proverb that goes, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Hello and welcome to Invest Africa. I'm Nozipho Mbanjwa. Now today we're looking at the higher education landscape on the continent. There may be a growing willingness in Africa to facilitate and to improve higher education opportunities for its billion-strong people, but there are a number of issues that are hindering the development of this space. We'll be looking at those challenges as well as the opportunities with a panel of experts today. Joining me in Johannesburg is Granville Smith. He's the Director and National Head of Education in this at KPMG. Ranesh Sivnarain is the Head of Forensic Services at the University of KwaZulu, Natal. And joining us from our Cape Town studio is Manie Regal. He's an Executive Director of Finance and Services at the University of the Western Cape. However, we're also going to be hearing from Teboho Moja. She's a clinical professor of higher education, and this at New York University. We spoke with her earlier this week, and she's going to be bringing her views to the table. She's been based in the US for 16 years, and her work on African higher education has continued to dominate her focus for the last decade and a half. So everyone, thank you so much for making the time to join us. And I think it's a good space for us just to start off by putting South Africa in context in terms of how we perform when it comes to higher education outcomes. And Granville, maybe let's bring the KPMG insight here. Where do we rank as a country in terms of higher education outcomes?
Thank you, Nozipho, and glad to be here today. I don't have for you the exact ranking where we are, but I think it is important that we share with you that education is one of those areas facing numerous challenges, as we're all aware. I think from an African continent perspective, around especially the research aspect of education, I think we will compare very favorably with the rest of the continent. I think we have our own unique challenges around funding, around student debt, etc. But so South Africa will rank favorably. I don't have an exact ranking, however, for you.
So Ranesh, coming from an institution, you'll probably be more acutely aware of the rankings, because we know that institutions are always jostling for the top 10 spots, if that's the case. When we take not just UKZN, but we take South Africa as a country, do we argue well, as Granville is indicating that on the continent we're actually doing fairly well, but globally where do we stand?
I think with regard to where we stand from a research point of view, there's various universities in South Africa that are ranked in the top 500. And so I think from a research point of view, we are really up there. But in terms of other aspects regarding governance and so forth, I don't have the numbers myself, but I think we are, I wouldn't say we are too far off from the rest of the world, because there's obviously governance challenges in various industries, not just in the education sector.
And of course, let's take this conversation to Cape Town. And Manie, let's bring you in, because what I'm really trying to get to with these opening questions is, as an emerging market, does South Africa's higher education perform favorably against other emerging markets? So we know that we're doing fairly well on the continent. Can you give us an emerging market picture? And in particular, if we just think of our peers in the BRICS grouping, are our higher education outcomes any better?
I think certainly from a quality perspective, and also, as was mentioned, the research, but what we also found is that in terms of volume or just sheer magnitude, we cannot compete from that perspective. But in terms of what we're churning out of our higher education system is of a high standard. And even from a policy direction, I think where we often fall short is just from an infrastructure perspective, and the government has recognized that the infrastructure needs to be improved and has ring-fenced funding, in fact, to see to that specific problem.
Well, funding is certainly coming up as an issue that we're going to pick up on. But before we do that, let's get insight that gives a comparison between Africa and the US in terms of higher education outcomes from Teboho.
I find that African higher education is, and I will use the cliche, on the move. In the first instance is the fact that higher education was really underfunded, and I'm sure lots of people know the history as to why it was underfunded, the World Bank policies that had convinced governments that there's low return in investing in higher education. they took a flip and changed that, which is exciting. They are now also putting money into higher education and encouraging governments in Africa to put money in higher education. So that's a change in terms of the funding. The second change is in terms of numbers of people who are participating in higher education. The numbers were very, very low. On average, we're looking at something like 6% participation rate, which is very low to support development. And now a number of countries are massifying the systems, which means they have over 15% participation rates. And so in terms of expansion of the number of people participating, there is expansion in terms of the number of institutions, even though there's still major disparities, because you have small countries like Gambia that still has one university. Then we have another big country like Nigeria with 47 universities, and I'm talking now just public universities. So it's growing. Most countries that had like one university are now having more universities. Total, we have about 2,000 institutions of higher education, which is still small, but compared with where we were 2 decades ago, we are increasing. Our participation rates are low. Most parts of the world, participation rates are high, even though we're moving. When it comes to quality of education, I would say questionable to some extent. Rapid expansion impacts quality. So in terms of that, I would say maybe the quality, not as good as it should be. In terms of pass rates, I don't have information on that, but I know definitely if quality is not good, I'm sure our pass rates are not good. So I could almost say that. That's more on the negative side. On the positive side, I think we are coping very well with high teacher-student ratios, as an example, mass classes and all, and offering education, even though we might question the quality, but teaching big classes, high overloads for professors teaching, lots of work, lots of marking and all that, and coping well with it and still producing good scholars and good academics. The US is doing very, very well. There's very good articulation. If somebody starts in a community college, they know they can end up at university. Our systems in Africa, in South Africa too, it has been very, very hard. If you start with one type of institution, you're stuck there.
Lots of issues that Teboho is putting on the table, from funding to quality versus quantity, access and equity, and all of these, you know, we could spend 2 hours talking about them. So let's take them in a piecemeal fashion. Granville, I want us to talk about the policy change, the step change that we've seen in the South African context, where we've seen specific policies pre-1994 and specific policies post-1994, and whether these policies have been effective in ensuring access, in ensuring equity, but also in ensuring quality of those outcomes.
Yeah, and I think it's important that I have here information around the student enrollment, say around 2002 in South Africa, which was around 650,000 students. Today, we're looking at close to 950. So we can clearly see access to education over the years has steadily improved. I also think from a transformation point of view, certainly and I unfortunately don't have specific percentages for you, but I think the percentage of black versus white has changed over that period, and in my view would have made a significant change. However, we probably still have a long way to go to make sure that we have access to higher education specifically for everybody qualifying. And I think the major constraint is the funding side. And I think that is worthwhile focusing on later.
And I think Ranesh can certainly pick this up as part of it. funding has changed, especially in a dispensation where it's about massification and it's about getting as many students in as possible, but at the same time having to fund the participation of those students. How would you describe the changes we've seen in higher education funding in South Africa, and who's bearing the most in terms of paying for higher education?
I think over the past few decades, you could see there's a hunger for higher education. And of course, you know, our disadvantaged communities are rising up to the challenge. And obviously that has put quite a bit of pressure on the government to try and find funding. And funding is a major issue. But you're finding that universities are coming up with some innovative ideas to try and fund those students that cannot afford funding. For example, NSFAS is able to only fund so many students. I know that there are universities in the country at the moment that are coming up with other ideas to try and get funding. For example, you know, getting further funding from donors, even using some of the investment income to try and fund further students. So I think there's a realization between universities that we cannot totally rely on government to provide the funding for education.
And I think you've raised an important point, and I want to take this to Manie, and this is of course looking at NSFAS, which is the National Student Financial Aid Scheme that Ranesh has put on the table. Established in 1991, first as a different organization and then morphing into what we know it to be today. Manie, is it effective? Not just in driving access, not just in driving equity, but ensuring that we actually have graduates at the other end of the pipeline?
Yes, thank you. I think initially it was called the old TEFS scheme.
Yes.
And it's now into what's called the NSFAS, National Student Financial Aid Scheme. And historically it has pulled in a huge quantity of students and it has provided the necessary access. However, it does exclude a huge component of the student population. And that's typically of students, well, historically, that of a family income of that's below 150,000 rand. For all of those that would qualify, and for all of those above 150,000 rand would not qualify. And on the other hand, also would not be able to attain financing on the outside. So what we find is that it is a bit disproportionate with respect to how the funding is spread. But it has a role to play in the success and, of course, of the providing the necessary access.
Well, on that note, with us just giving a very, very brief overview of the current landscape of higher education globally in Africa and the South African context, let's take a short break. When we come back, we're going to be digging a little bit deeper into the opportunities and the challenges that continue to plague higher education in South Africa. We'll see you in a minute. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with Invest Africa. And still staying with me here are my guests in Johannesburg, Granville Smith. He's the Director and National Head of Education at KPMG. Ranesh Sivnarain is the Head of Forensic Services at the University of KwaZulu Natal. And joining us from Cape Town is Manie Regal. He's an Executive Director of Finance and Services at the University of the Western Cape. I want to start in the Western Cape. I want to pick up on a comment that Manie made before we went to break. And this is, of course, the fact that NSFAS still leaves a lot of the population that don't meet its threshold in terms of the means test without access to higher education. Manie, those who are in higher education and those who have either gotten student financial aid or are funding the studies themselves are also complaining of an increase in tuition fees. How can you give us a sense of the rationale behind the increase in tuition fees that we've seen in South Africa? Because this seems to be an annual phenomenon and one that oftentimes is even ahead of inflation. How do we make sense of this?
The higher education institutions find themselves torn in between the way the economy is evolving and the fact that you have the unions pulling in one direction, you have the student body pulling in another direction, and then you also have the institution itself that has to remain sustainable. So it is a complex financial formula in which one would plug in numbers and determine what is the best and most efficient way to determine, or rather the best rate that one can apply for students. But I think we're always going to be in a contesting environment, since the students would pull in the direction of not wanting to pay a high fee, whereas the labor on the other side would pull in the other direction. So the one is going to be dependent on the other. And then, of course, the main thing being state subsidy, which has been on a decline in real terms. And that has caused huge problems within the sector. We found ways and means of dealing with it by becoming even more efficient and even super efficient. But it comes with great difficulty, and I think there is no way of getting around moving away from the increases that will be implemented into the future. So I think it's always going to be above inflation. Inflation is set between 3% and 5%. And higher education is around 10% on an average basis across the sector.
Absolutely, on an annual basis. And you've raised another issue, and I want you to pick this up, please, Ranesh. And this is, of course, the decreasing subsidies that are coming from the government into higher education. How is this impacting on what institutions can actually do in terms of their efficiency with the funds that they have available to them?
I think it's a challenge for all the universities in the country, where, with the decreased funding available for students, that universities must try and make some other means to try and address that demand. I think it's, each university is addressing it in a very different way. And it's difficult to put almost like a benchmark and say this is how the universities should be addressing it, or this is how they're doing it. But I think that